Welcome to Decoding Disinformation. We are kicking off the first episode of our second season with a compelling conversation about the rise of extremism in Austria, where the Freedom Party recently won the European elections. Their victory is rooted in rhetoric based on false narratives against immigration and independent media, among other issues. Today, our guest is Austrian journalist Ingrid Brodnig, one of the country's leading experts on far-right movements and online disinformation. We'll explore the strategies these parties use to depict sort of a global power working against the people. In these conspiratorial narratives, the media is often labeled as being mouthpieces at the service of these powers, fostering a pervasive distrust in mainstream media. As Austria heads towards its upcoming parliamentary elections in September, the rhetoric against the media is expected to escalate. Ingrid will help us to understand the global implications of these trends and draw parallels with populist movements in other countries. I'm your host, Javier Luque, head of digital communications at the International Press Institute, and together with our partners, the news outlets TAZ in Germany and Faktograf in Croatia, we are conducting a series of investigations into disinformation campaigns against the press. Join us for this insightful conversation with Ingrid Brodnig as we decode the disinformation shaping the political landscape in Austria and beyond. Thank you very much for taking the time to participate in this podcast, Ingrid.
Sure, I'm glad to be here.
So this is the first episode of the second season of Decoding Disinformation, and we want to place the focus on the European elections and the increasing support that extremist political parties are gaining in different countries in Europe, one of which, of course, is Austria. So FPÖ won the elections, the European elections earlier this month by 1% of the votes. I think that the first question is quite simple and straightforward. Why?
In Austria, we have for quite some time now a very strong right-wing populist party. And it's also to some extent the mobilization problems the conservatives have, where you can see that former voters of the conservatives have switched to the Freedom Party, to the FPÖ. So I think there are many explanations there. I think that the topic of migration is very important for the Freedom Party. And in the last months, this topic has become more visible again. And always a time when people talk about migration, especially in a negative context, this is helpful for the right-wing populists. The second thing is, for most of the voters, the COVID pandemic is not important anymore. It's important to a very low in extent. But for the Freedom Party voters, it's more often important. So there you see people who are still angry with the laws, with the rules during that time. And also, I would suggest the Freedom Party, the right-wing populists, were the only one who also catered to a conspiracy-prone audience. So a very small part of the population believed in conspiracy theories, believed very outrageous ideas during the pandemic. And this is also a part of the voting population. So also the Freedom Party is the only party which really catered to this audience. There are more aspects than this too, but I think migration is the biggest aspect, and the coronavirus, COVID-19, is also to some extent also relevant here.
You've already laid out some of the false narratives that we have also observed in other countries as well across Europe, right? Being quite prominent also within the political discourses of these extremist movement. But what's the role of these false narratives? What role have they played in increasing support for extremist and populist movements in Austria?
It's interesting. the Freedom Party uses very harsh and to some extent unscientific rhetoric, by which I mean that they portray the world in a very dark way, where an elite is kind of working against the people. And it's often suggested that the real story is not being told by the elites, by the mainstream media and by other parties. And you have certain topics that are important for this narrative. Migration is a very important topic here, where in the past you have had somewhat wrong posts also about migration. On the other hand, of course, you also have real crime cases where, for example, a perpetrator might be a migrant. So they can often use also real crimes in a pluralistic society. The second thing is they use topics like migration, but also like climate change to distinguish themselves from other parties. When you look at climate change, we also see kind of false or not 100% correct claims being produced by the party. I remember one claim, for example, where a politician from the right-wing populists kind of said that the combustion engine, the modern combustion engine, is kind of much better than people would often portray it, or kind of they were very pro-combustion engine. Then there was a fact check by a media organization which shows this claim is not correct. So you have like a narrative which suggests the climate change the climate crisis is not as like horrible as the other parties or as some scientists will tell you. So I think this is a very dangerous narrative, because we need a consensus fighting climate change. And the Freedom Party is the one party that is especially skeptical here. And the third thing, when it comes to disinformation, I really must say, during the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, you could see that in the rhetoric, the party was very approachable for people who believe conspiracy theories. So they would be the one party that would kind of be kind of very friendly towards people in these online groups. And so it's often not 100% the case that the party itself is just producing disinformation. It's often more like half-truths or very emotional accusations towards powerful elites, like the World Economic Forum, for example, or like other parties. And in the communities themselves, in the communities that are very positive towards the right-wing populist, users who are not politicians themselves will often then spread falsehoods. So it's a bit, it's often complicated to say, how do you distinguish disinformation and who is spreading them? I would say some claims can be fact-checked by the Freedom Party, and then they're not correct or not 100% correct. But overall, even more important is that there is an online community which is very friendly towards the right-wing populists, where you will find a lot of falsehoods, even more than in the official party language.
We will talk about this online community, later on in this podcast, because I think that that's one of the key components of disseminating and spreading disinformation, right? To reach a wider audience. But let me quickly go back to, again, to a more like general overview of the impact and the role of on disinformation. And let me ask you specifically about whether you have observed if these false narratives also include attacks against journalists and independent media in Austria.
Yes. These false claims and this exaggerated language can also affect journalists who are just doing their work. I can think of one recent example. there was a normal street interview by the public broadcaster ORF, and the journalist, he asked the candidate from the Freedom Party a very ordinary question. It is about the far-right fraction in the EU Parliament, where the Freedom Party is a part of, and they are in quite a turbulent time after the AfD has been kind of banned from their group. And so this journalist, he asked how voters of the party can be sure that their vote is in good hands with all these turbulences between the right-wing populists and the right-wing extremists in the EU Parliament. And the politician, he kind of completely he stopped the interview. He got very kind of mad at the question, and he portrayed it in a way that he himself was called right-wing extremist, which he wasn't. And this is a falsehood by which this interview was kind of shunned, was kind of made into something horrible among the community of the party. So you have to understand, the party itself, they kind of had a video of this interview, and they uploaded just the reaction of the politician. They did not upload the question of the journalist, and they had strong accusations against the public broadcaster. And I would say that they portrayed the question of the journalist in a very wrong light. They made it something different than it was, and they used it to portray an image of the public broadcaster as producing left-wing propaganda. And this is how it works. If you are a journalist and you ask a critical question, but a question that is absolutely normal in the media, in a way how media work, you have to fear that there will be retributions. For example, the interview might be ended at this point, so it might be over. You can ask no more questions. Or there might be some video footage uploaded, but it's not showing the whole picture, just the accusations of the party. And this was one incident during the EU elections. But you have to understand that the EU elections were just kind of the beginning of this year for us, because we have the national elections in autumn. And so even the EU elections, they were more like a first feeling barometer, how the population is thinking, how they're feeling about politics. And you can see that the Freedom Party at the moment is very, very strong. Even in the election, they were in the first place.
So basically what you refer to is at this point is that also in Austria, far right ideologies and leaders also present themselves as the victims of the media, right?
Exactly. And I also want to add something. The Freedom Party, its new leader, Herbert Kickl, during his time, the party has become even more radical in the tone that it uses. In the German-speaking countries, there is a word, it's called remigration. It's used often by far-right extremists. In a far-right extremist context, remigration does not just mean that you get rid of asylum seekers, but it can also mean that you search for ways to get rid of citizens who are migrants, like people who migrated or whose parents migrated, or their grandparents migrated to Austria but are citizens. And remigration does mean that you also try to find ways to get rid of people who are migrants or whose ancestors were migrants. And this is important because the Freedom Party uses this word in a positive way. And Herbert Kickl himself, he has found very positive words about, for example, the far-right group called Identitäre. He called them ein unterstützenswertes Projekt, so a project which could be kind of supported. And for example, the Identitäre use remigration in this context. Why am I saying this? This is not disinformation. This is more like ideology. And when you look at the ideology, at the language which communicates ideology, you can see that the language has become harsher and harsher.
It is interesting because that actually sets them apart from the example that you just described before, when the politician from the Freedom Party reacted strongly against being labeled as a far right, as an extremist opposition. So that's also an interesting item to keep an eye in the upcoming elections. But how these false narratives against journalists and also against migrants usually propagate in Austria? So do they start on social media platforms, and are these attacks instigated also by the polarizing political rhetoric?
So for the right-wing populists, social media is extremely important. They have created online communities where they tell their fans that they should only listen to them, not to mainstream media and not to, for example, other parties. And the Freedom Party has been also for many years leading social media in the way how innovative they are, and also in the way how should I say, how diligent they are, that they really keep on posting, they really keep on making content. So now you have online communities which are really very big and quite like they're really seeing these things the same way as the party itself. So in such cases, the party will upload an accusation and their fans will spread it. And the problem is when you then show like a news item, or you bring an article which is critical, the fans are already in the mindset that they don't have to listen anymore. And this kind of method ensures that the party can do a lot of questionable things without having to answer for their behavior, because their fans have learned that criticism of the party is not valid. And social media is the key to do this. Without social media, this media strategy would not work.
What's the impact of these campaigns against, fact-based journalism has taken in Austria, and then do you think that their credibility might be at stake?
Absolutely. When you look at trustworthiness and how people are trusting the media, we see huge differences between people who are left-wing, who are more in the center, or people who are right-wing. And according to people who are right-wing, you should not trust a lot of typical media organizations. So I would guess that this rhetoric that the party has used for a long time, even before social media, I must say, that this rhetoric, it works quite well. We see huge differences on how people on the right think about the media and how people in the center or left-wing people see the media.
The parliamentary elections in Austria are due in September 29th this year. Do you expect that this rhetoric against the media will increase as we approach
Absolutely.
That date?
Actually, the more important an election is, especially important for the Freedom Party, when it has the chance to become the first most successful party in the election. In such an election, you will have, in my opinion, a more heated up debate. And a more heated up debate includes harsh remarks about journalists usually. So, for example, we have had the presidential elections in 2016, which was also a very important election for the Freedom Party because they thought that they would win the parliamentary election, which they didn't. But it was very, very close. And during this time, the language was extremely harsh, also against journalists, I would say. And I think that we might have a similar election this year. The language of the Freedom Party is so that they call all the other parties the Einheitspartei, which means kind of like the unity party, suggesting that all other parties are the same and only the Freedom Party would be the party which is really for the people, which is really helping the people. And this is an important trick. This is a method by which the party portrays the world in black and white, by which I mean black is everybody else and white is only the party and the people who are like in line with the party. And such a black and white election campaign is always dangerous because in such a black and white election campaign, critical journalism is black. It's part of like the other side. So I'm very curious and somewhat nervous to see how this election will present itself. I don't know what will happen, but I'm pretty sure it will be a very heated up and a very emotional campaign.
At a global level, so how do you read the results of the European elections? So can they serve as sort of a cautionary tale for the US elections in November?
So I think overall, the European elections are, to be honest, not such a good symbol for other elections because unfortunately, we don't have a European Union where people really feel themselves being European citizens. I mean, many people do not. So often an EU election reflects more the national debates going on. And also, when you compare national elections to European elections, national elections are often, in Austria at least, much more heated up, much more emotional. So it's closer to the hearts of people. But when I look at the US election, it's interesting because you see somewhat similar trends in the United States. For example, Donald Trump, he uses language which is very common to right-wing populists in Europe. For example, he uses ad hominem arguments to make his opponents seem untrustworthy. I give you an example. By ad hominem argument, you mean that in a debate, suddenly the debate is not about the issue itself, but about the person who is speaking. And you will have ad hominem arguments, for example, against journalists by Donald Trump. Perhaps you remember this horrible moment where Trump even ridiculed a reporter who has like some, I don't know, how do you say, who is disabled, and he ridiculed him during a speech. And this is extremely insulting, but it's also a way to kind of, if you don't have good arguments on the issue. In this case, it was about the question if Donald Trump exaggerated or portrayed some things in a wrong way. And if you don't have good arguments, strong arguments on the issue, you can change your tactic and attack the person. He did so by attacking the journalist who is also disabled and making fun of him. And this is not just extremely insulting. I would say it's a strategy by being so harsh to critics, for example. You also show to your own audience those people are not trustworthy. You make fun of them, or you're being really insulting, but you communicate to your fans, to your audience, those are people who don't need to be treated in a fair or neutral way. And I think that this aggressive style in communication is something that also right-wing populists in Europe use. So it's interesting, these aggressive methods on how to deal with other political parties or how to deal with media. These methods are kind of universal. They're internationally used. And in different countries, we see populists who are using those methods quite successful.
Just to finish this first episode of the second season of Decoding Disinformation, so you've been talking throughout this episode and this conversation how populists and extremists tap on the fears of their audience to capitalize, on this discontent, to rally their forces, right, and their support, tapping on the fears, appealing to the anger instead of the reason. What are those fears in Austria? What are the fears of their audience in Austria?
To be honest, this is a very good question, because when you look at the topics that are important for voters, you would have migration, or you would have COVID-19 for part of the right-wing populist voters. But I think that the question in itself, it shows you more about rhetoric and about mobilization. Because very often when people see an issue, there's the one question if this is the biggest issue, or if a party has managed to make this an issue. And I think that the right-wing populists are very good to keep, for example, always bringing up migration, even in moments where migration is perhaps, or like in cases where migration is not the issue there, or just like a side note, to always make it seem as if this is the only thing we need to talk about. Even in election interviews, you will often have a question about, for example, the economy, or a question about environment. And it takes them 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 30 seconds to steer away the debate from the issue at hand, like the economy or like climate change. And suddenly you are talking again about migration. So I'm a person, I do not believe that the topics we are talking about always reflect the topics that are just the only important topics, but it often more reflects the diligence and the success of a party, which topics they have infused in the public debate. Of course, we need to talk about all these issues, but let me give you an example. Of course, we need to talk about migration, but I would also say we would need to talk about climate change. And I would guess that the right-wing populists have the wish, or they're trying to have a public debate where we talk a lot about migration and perhaps not so much about climate change and the urgency of climate change. So I think that when you ask me what is important for the people, for the voters, I do not know. Because I think the media debate, it does not portray what is important for us as a society, but it often portrays what different parties or different groups have managed to make visible in the public debate. And getting back to your question, so let's see if migration will be a big issue during the election. If that is the case, that would be quite helpful for example, the right-wing parties. Or let's see if, for example, climate change is a big issue. this can also be influenced, for example, by the climate, by the weather this year. So there are many factors. I don't know yet what will happen. I only know one thing, or at least I'm sure of one thing. This will not be a pleasant time in Austria, because I'm pretty sure it will be a very heated up political debate we'll be having.
Thank you very much for your time, Ingrid. We will definitely keep an eye on the evolution of disinformation and extremist rhetoric in Austria, and the impact on various human rights, and also especially on the impact of on journalists, including yourself. Thank you very much for your time.
If I may add something, just one last thing. And if this is the case, that this election will be quite heated up, getting back to the issue at hand, then we'll also see disinformation. Because an election where you see a lot of polarization, this is also an election where you see disinformation. When people are polarized, which means that they are angry at the other side, it's much easier to make disinformation being viral, to spread it. And so if we see a heated up debate, we'll also see wrong statements online, we'll see falsehoods online spreading.
It seems that it's in the interest of those who want to heat up the political debate, tapping into the fears and anger of their audience to somehow put on the same level opinions and facts, right? As a way to create this kind of fertile ground where they can plant quickly, their own narratives and disinformation and falsehoods, basically. So
exactly.
We will definitely keep an eye on this issue here in Austria. Thank you very much again for your time and for your expertise, and I look forward to our next conversation, Ingrid.
Thank you, Javier.